Thank you, Jacques. I'm delighted to be here to share a few thoughts about the election. Let me pick up where Jim Gerstein left off, but with some difference of interpretation about the data. Let me start with the bottom line. Michael Barone, who is one of America's leading experts on polling and American politics, who is widely respected across the political spectrum, rigorous but not afraid to make a pointed comment, had a piece just in the last couple of days about the Jewish vote. My colleague Michelle Swears may have picked up on some of this earlier in the morning. I was teaching until 12:15, so I missed it. But the bottom line in Michael Barone's analysis, which is data-driven and so on, is that whereas Obama in the 2008 election got among American Jewish voters a margin of nearly 4-1, that all things considered in this November's election, he's likely to get something over a 2-1 margin instead of the almost 4-1 before. A couple of thoughts about the data in reaction to the slides you saw. One of them is that a week is a long time in politics. Gallup in 1948 famously called the election for Thomas E. Dewey instead of Harry Truman because they stopped polling about 3 weeks before the election. The data you saw, I'm not challenging the accuracy or validity or rigor of it, is the latest data is from July. July to now is a long time in politics. If you look at the campaign, whether you favor Romney or Obama, the reality is that for much of the past 6 months, advertising on TV by both the Obama campaign and by PACs and other groups in league with it spent months and months belittling and defining in the most negative ways Mitt Romney and everything he represents and has done over the course of his career. The picture was so one-sided and so slanted that when the first debate took place a couple of weeks ago, as you know, Romney came out of it with an enormous margin in public evaluation of how he had done. He prevailed by margins of as much as 3-1 or 2.5-1 in terms of how people perceived it, and the impact in the polls was stunning. Political polling is a tricky business, but the most widely respected poll over the years has been that of Gallup. Gallup and Rasmussen have been the two most accurate polls in the last several elections, although they often differ between the two of them. As I think many of you know, among likely voters, the last available Gallup poll, which was on Real Clear Politics on Sunday, showed Romney with a 7-point lead. To be fair, the Real Clear Politics average shows it Romney only with a 0.3% lead and Rasmussen with a 2-point lead. Now, the reason I mention that, and coming back to the whole Jewish vote issue, is that opinion has been shifting. I wouldn't dare to predict where we'll go between now and the election, let alone after the debate tonight. But I will say that the data that you saw has to be taken with a grain of salt because it's a bit stale. In fairness, the other problem is the Jewish, in doing any sample of Jewish voters, the sample sizes are a real problem since Jews are estimated to be about 2% of the American public. However, not only Michael Barone's data, but several other sources have indicated that the Jewish vote was somewhat higher than you saw historically, that Obama got, according to almost all the surveys except the one cited, 78 or 79% of the Jewish vote last time. There has been a significant drop-off in polls that have been done since, especially ones more recently, which would why Michael Barone would indicate that Obama is likely to prevail among Jewish voters by a little more than 2-1 instead of almost 4-1. It's still a huge margin, but there has been some significant identifiable erosion. I'd also say that the impact of the Jewish vote is likely to be somewhat greater than what you've heard, partly because there's a fallacy of composition. It's true that Jews are 2% of the electorate, but Jews vote consistently and in higher percentages than most other sectors of the electorate, which does tend to mean more. And in states like Florida, Ohio, and some others, you could have a situation where, given the overall picture, a shift of some thousands or tens of thousands, or in Florida even hundreds of thousands of vote, could make a critical difference if the election in these states comes down to a razor-thin margin. Also about issues, Jews vote like other Americans, although as the old joke goes, Jews earn like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans. What motivates them, however, and I agree with that part of the analysis, is I think for most Jewish voters, the state of the economy, jobs, unemployment, economic growth, the deficit are leading factors. However, a lot depends on how you measure what are the most important issues. In the survey you saw that listed 10 items, sprinkled through that, starting at number 3 or 4 and then going on, were at least 3 discrete foreign policy issues. One was national security generally. The one just below it was Israel. And then finally, a little farther down the list, was Iran. It seems to me if you combine those 3, and again, those are matters of concern with Jewish voters, I'm not making the argument that foreign policy is more important than economic policy, but what I am saying is that the economy, is that in addition to the economy, foreign policy and Israel really do matter. I won't even touch on the other aspect of polling, which is to ask the question, who's a Jew? But the Program for Jewish Civilization does a nice job under Jacques' leadership of addressing that in various programs and fora, which I think many of you have seen. I also want to take on, is Mr. Gerstein still here? No, that's too bad. I want to take on J Street. He's a board member of J Street, but I want to take it on in the context of a reasoned discourse and how American Jews size up Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Americans as a whole, when asked the question, with whom do your sympathies most lie, Palestinians or Israelis, or Arabs or Israelis, depending on how you frame it, opinion polling for the last 3 or 4 decades has been fairly consistent. Americans support Israel over their adversaries by margins of about 4 to 1. Now, it's certainly true that the American Jewish community is pluralistic. It's been so all along. And you have an element of the American Jewish community which is quite dovish. I would call that those who are active in Americans for Peace Now and in J Street. And you have a smaller fringe which I would describe as anti-Israel Jews. That's a separate pathology in my judgment. But I think there's a problem with what's happened with liberal Jews in this regard. As you know, the Democratic Party was once the heart of pro-Israeli support in American politics. Moreover, The Nation magazine, which now is a band leader for pieces, arguments, and so on, which are heavily slanted against Israel. I won't say they are off the ultimate far end of the spectrum, but pretty close to it. So The Nation has shifted radically over the years. The balance of views within the Democratic Party itself is one which is still more sympathetic to Israel, but support for Israel among Democrats is much more contested than among Republicans. I didn't bring data with me given the time and because I was teaching until just a moment ago, but the support for Israel in the Democratic Party, among people who consider themselves Democrats, only has a modest majority. Among Republicans, the support for Israel is between 80 and 85%. To some extent, there has been erosion or attrition in support for Obama because of what are perceived as his policies toward Israel, Iran, and national security. The changes are subtle but identifiable. And as I say, I'd be willing to wager that the support once the election takes place 2 weeks from now is more likely to show the kinds of trends I'm referring to than those which Josh Gerstein talked about just a few minutes ago. You might say, well, what's the reason why groups like J Street and so on prevailed? Ironically, it draws on something which is intrinsic to Jewish culture and even Jewish religion. And it's the effort to try to, I'm not quite sure what words I want to use, but the effort to reach out, to engage, to think about the other, and so forth. And because the Middle East peace process is really stalemated at an impasse, basically because there's no party, there's no one actor on the other side who's capable of making peace. I can quote the great creator of modern sociology, Max Weber, who argued a century ago that the test of a polity is that it has the monopoly of legitimate force within its political framework, within its territory. The problem is there are two Palestines, Gaza and the West Bank, and they're at war with each other. And no Palestinian leader has the capacity to enter into hard bargaining, tough negotiation, make the necessary compromises, be believable to his adversary, and make the arrangement stick in terms of ending the conflict and abiding by the results. That's tragic. It's a tragedy for the Palestinians. It's also a tragedy for Israel. But in the context of this impasse, the problem is always to look outward. Well, if the Palestinians can't do something, then the Israelis should. And it often, I think, results in unrealistic demands on Israel. At the margins, this can slip into something that's manifestly unfair. And here I'll quote Anatoly Sharansky, the courageous Soviet dissident who later became a cabinet minister and a moral authority within Israel, who warns against what he calls the 3Ds. And it's a way of deciding when anti-Israeli thought or criticism of Israel lapses into anti-Semitism. The first D is double standards. Do you hold Israel to standards that others don't hold it to? You can find that, alas, in some of the statements by figures in the mainline Protestant denominations. The second D is demonization. And the third is delegitimation. There's a risk that in, let's say, criticism of Israel that slips into double standards, that there's a slippery slope. Finally, although the talk is mainly about the Jewish vote and so on, I can say a word about some of the mindset among certain American Protestant figures who've been active in this. Most of them who take on the issue of Israel, call for boycotts and embargoes and end of aid and the rest, come from the activist wing of these groups where other people aren't paying attention. In 1988, I was the coordinator of Middle East issues for the Dukakis campaign. This is my last anecdote. And I had I represented Governor Dukakis in meetings with all kinds of outside groups. And on one occasion, I was tasked to meet with a group called Christians for Middle East Peace. It was three very leftist Protestant religious leaders. I don't remember their denominations exactly. And this is a time when Saddam Hussein was at issue and so on. He had used poison gas against the Kurds. The UN had reported about his biological. There were concerns about biological and chemical weapons and maybe nuclear. And I had raised these people came in and wanted to talk about Israel. And somehow I brought up the subject of Saddam and his use of poison gas against the Kurds, and whether he should be pressured to drop those programs. And one of the leader of this group looked at me and smiled and said, well, you know, weapons of those kinds of weapons are the poor man's nuclear weapon. Well, I thought to myself, wait a minute, this person is supposed to represent a religious denomination, and he's making excuses for mass murder and the use of poison gas on the part of a deplorable regime like Saddam Hussein. So when I come back to this issue of double standards and so forth, I think that among the American Jewish community, there is some erosion from people who have voted Democratic and who have voted for Obama in the past. A lot of it has to do with the general disappointment that has created in this election what is now either a tie or as much as a 7% majority for Obama. Jews are part of that shift, not by any means by the same scale, but the Jewish vote will not be as pro-Obama or as pro-democratic as it has been in previous elections. Thanks for listening. If we have time for questions, so much the better.
Thank you, Professor Lieber. Questions for Professor Lieber? Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, in Gallup, if I said, I meant that Gallup shows Romney leading by 7%. Did I say the opposite? Sorry.
Really things to rally the base these days?
Well, first of all, opinion polls are only snapshots. There's my criticism of the data you saw, which stopped in July. And the polls I quoted essentially are tracking polls of the last week. Obviously, they're national polls. The three polls I would mention are first Gallup, which shows Romney by 7, Rasmussen, that shows Romney by 2, and the Real Clear Politics average of polls, which shows Romney by 0.3. It's certainly true that the key to the election will be the swing states. But even there's some evidence from swing state polling that those races have tightened. Until about a week ago, there was talk, well, that Romney is doing much better overall, but in the swing states, it won't be the case. I think state polling is much more dicey because it's harder to get an accurate sample within a state compared to a more accurate sample nationally, and Gallup has a very good track record nationally. The other thing is that Gallup, the Real Clear Politics average right now is showing Romney with a slight lead in electoral votes, leaning and more or less given 205 or 206 for Romney and 201 for Obama. Those numbers could change overnight depending on the debate tonight, but there it is.
Other questions for Professor Lieber? I've got a question. Since we're speaking about polling, it's simply unprecedented, or so we were told, that a debate could influence an election that much one way or the other. We had heard this prior to the first debate. Apparently, common wisdom was wrong. As a veteran political scientist, since we've never seen this before, do you have any explanation for why that one debate tilted the election as much as it did?
Yes, I do. Again, I'm trying to speak as a political scientist. I have my own views and preferences, but the advertising, the Republicans didn't have their nominee until Romney wrapped it up and had the convention and all the rest of it. Romney was laboring under two disadvantages. One, the Dems knew all along who their nominee was, and once it became evident to them that the opponent was going to be Romney, they've been saturating the airwaves with anti-Romney commercials. Not commercials about what Obama's plan for the future is. His plan for the future is more of the same, plus an increase in taxes on the top 2%. Instead, the thrust of it, and I'm sure the content analysis will show that, was anti-Romney, whether it's a steel worker or an industrial worker saying that basically Romney killed his wife because he took away her health insurance and she died of cancer. By the way, a narrative that was false, but widely circulated and shown, and so on and so forth. So the consequence is that uncommitted and inattentive voters had this image of Romney, which was relentlessly negative. They then saw 70 million people tuned into the first debate, and they saw a Romney who was very different, who handled himself well, was moderate, well-spoken, and showed gravitas, and looked, whether one liked him or not, favored him or not, as somebody who could be a plausible president. So I think there was a kind of reaction to what had been out there because of the images of Romney. The other fact is that, it's a fact, not an opinion, that the so-called mainstream media and mainstream journalists lean overwhelmingly toward Dems rather than Republicans. Now, it's true the Republicans have their own media, Fox, obviously, the Wall Street Journal, some of the weekly magazines, but the bulk of the networks and cable and the newspapers are lean toward the Democrats and Obama. And again, those who are getting their information from that would have been affected very much by it. And seeing Romney in person, speaking for himself, in that sustained way, helped to level the playing field.
Professor Lieber, just stay right there. We're just wondering where Ambassador Ross is. We're out trying to find out. In the interim, Professor Lieber, would you take a couple more questions?
Sure.
Is that okay? Yes, sir.
You had mentioned J Street early on. And I'm just curious what impact you think they do have on the electorate, I guess, if any.
I don't think J Street has much of an impact. At the start, it looked like they might. Obviously, among liberal and left liberal Jews, among younger voters, among those with less connection to Israel, they've had some effect. But at the start, the result was that there was a piece about them in the New York Times Sunday magazine, which was an adoring cover story, except that the head of J Street was quoted as saying, "We see ourselves as Obama's blocking," using a football metaphor, Obama's blocking back on the Hill, which meant there was, it wasn't just about the broader issues of trying to pull Israel in a more peace-minded direction by their lights, but that it was a partisan Obama effort to redress tensions between Obama and Israel. Secondly, they did get for a time a number of congressmen who seemed to be willing to speak and endorse J Street and so forth, until there were revelations about funding. What J Street claimed about their funding proved to be false. They had funding from foreign sources, they had funding from George Soros, they had funding from others who were identified not just as, on the more dovish side of the American Jewish spectrum, but rather farther over than that. That hurt them a lot, and they just don't have the legitimacy on Capitol Hill and so on that they might have had under other circumstances. One last observation, and it's a kind of pathetic one. I have an acquaintance whom I've known politically over the years who's been involved with J Street, spoke at their convention. I think he may have been a list of supporters of them, and was basically a Carterite in terms of his policies. And he confessed in a weak moment to a friend of mine that he was, quote, a self-hating Jew, unquote. Now, I don't want to say that that's true of J Street overall, and I think the leaders of J Street have made an effort to try to maintain their legitimacy. But I think for a certain element here, that psychological dimension is part of it. But obviously what I've said would be deeply controversial. Let me stop at that point.
Thank you so much, Professor Lieber.
Mm-hmm.